All right. Happy Thursday, June 21st, 2018 to you all. This is the Kubernetes SIG Architecture Community Meeting. I am your co-host, Jason Dumars, and your other co-host is Brian Grant, who I'm not seeing on the meeting yet, but I'm sure will be here soon. If you are following along after the fact or you would like to look at the agenda, it is available at bit.ly/sig-architecture. And looks like there's a little bit of AV problems in the Google room, so hopefully people will be joining shortly. So let's go ahead and kick the meeting off here. So looking at the agenda, the first thing we have up is a talk about the API review process. And just briefly, so the idea behind this was that there have been a number of initiatives over the past couple of years to try and formalize this process. And in the document that I've linked to, and let me copy and paste this review or the process here into chat so you all have it. This document is actually the culmination of other people's efforts and trying to coalesce them into some sort of document that makes sense for people to follow, and also to try and set precedents about SIG architecture also driving some policies. So the idea behind this is that we essentially are reviewing entry or the conformance related API changes and putting some rigor around how those are reviewed and approved, and then also offering sort of reviews as a service for people who are writing CRDs that want to ensure that their implementation is consistent, that whoever is the users of their CRDs have a very consistent experience, because oftentimes when people are engaging with CRDs, they don't necessarily understand where the boundaries of the normal APIs are and where the CRD is. So it's really good for the user community to establish strong rigor and process around the API conventions, just as a general rule. So that was sort of the genesis of this process and proposal. Obviously, there's a lot in here, and it took me until pretty much this morning to get it sent out to the architecture list just so that it could be reviewed. I don't necessarily want to get into a deep discussion on it today, more just bring everybody's attention to it, and we can review it asynchronously over the course of the next week. I'd like to have a decision to proceed as soon as we're able to do that, and it feels like there's some consensus around the process. Because there are a ton of KEPs and other things in the pipeline that have API review implications, and it would be nice to get this sorted as soon as possible so that we can roll those forward. So please take a look at the document at your convenience, and we'll go from there. Is there anything that you'd like to add, Brian, or anybody else in the room there?
Hey, Jace, this is Tim. Thanks for writing the doc. It's really good. I think the most interesting part is at the very end. So I might suggest restructuring to put the workflow towards the beginning.
Cool, I can do that. Any other things?
So the doc has had a lot of additions since I last looked at it. What process are we suggesting for queuing these up in the review meetings and prioritizing them?
Essentially, they would be issues in a repo that's dedicated to these. So there would be a Kubernetes/API-reviews repository. And then essentially there's a role in there, the moderator role, that is responsible for queuing those up and working with the reviewers to prioritize. So
well, if we use the project Kanban style thing, they don't actually need to be issues, right? Like you can just put text in there, you can link to issues and PRs. that are in flight, and they're kind of easier to shuffle around.
Mhm.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. Are you planning on literally stack ranking them or just assigning them to like priority tiers?
Well, we need to stack rank them to get them bucketed into meetings at least.
Yeah, my idea or my goal was that these issues would be, the tracking issues would be stack ranked in the backlog. So whatever's at the top of the backlog is highest priority and what's at the bottom is lowest. Because that makes it really easy for reviewers to rapidly move priority up or down and doesn't make it a huge involved process.
It wasn't clear from the doc whether you intended every issue to come to a meeting or whether you wanted to assign them to reviewers first and only move them to meetings if they needed to be.
Yeah, the document basically indicates that the reviewer, if they feel like it needs to be reviewed by more than one person, so it's something with complex or other involved parts of it, that that they would pull in other folks as necessary or as they saw fit, or pull in SIG architecture. So part of the idea of being a reviewer is that you have the discretion to make some decisions about how widely it is reviewed or what the impact is.
So in that regard, it's not fundamentally different than the process today. It's just more formalized, right?
More or less, yes, that's exactly right. And it focuses on those owners that are reviewers in the owner's file for that repo.
We have a hand up at Mr. Wise.
Bob.
Hey there. I believe it was discussed that this was not the domain of SIG API machinery, that the API was sort of too critical a first-class citizen to be reviewed by anything other than this group. But I think it would be worth it to put a short statement in the doc just clarifying that, because I think a newcomer to this would immediately have that question.
To be clear, these are not API machinery people. These are people in the API reviewers list.
Yeah. So
I do see that as a-
Consider then perhaps then that statement, like whatever is the statement, so that people kind of understand, because it would be easy for someone to say,
Believe me, I make this statement every chance I get.
yes, no, I agree. So we've been trying to identify sub-projects of SIG architecture, much like sub-projects in other SIGs, and API governance is actually one of the longest standings kind of sub-projects that predates SIG architecture. And there is an official list of API reviewers that are kind of cross SIG. In general, we expect proposals and APIs to be vetted by the technical leaders and owners of sub-projects within the individual SIGs first, and then come to the API reviewers and approvers, which there are explicit lists of those people for issues about API consistency, API approval, especially for whole new APIs.
I'd like to really,
like that.
I want to emphasize though that historically the process is get your SIG to sign off on something, write all the code, then get an API review, which inevitably finds something that you need to change, which means you need to go back to square one, but probably it's the week before code freeze, and so you're unhappy about
it depends. I mean, some people actually remember the guidance about, do your proposal first, then get a review of the API type, and then write the code.
Yeah.
So it depends on how long you've been on the project.
And I think people don't always appreciate that, like, I honestly expect to review even like single field changes, our API changes, and they need the same level of scrutiny, maybe not the same level of time commitment, but they need to be scrutinized, and they are subject to the change in terms of conventions and whatever, just as a new API type is. And honestly, even the comments around a field, because they now carry metadata for the code generation and other things, those are subject to review as well.
So it looks like Joe has his hand up.
Yeah, I think as we look at a process like this, it's important to realize that there's at least three parties involved. There's the person writing the API, there's the reviewing of like an approval process, but then I think it's also important to recognize that there's going to be a bunch of folks that are auditing the process that actually want to keep track and sort of learn from it. And so having clear lines of sight in terms of which APIs are coming and what reviews look like and the types of things that people are looking for, I think that's something that we're really missing right now. There is no place where we can go and actually get this sort of flow of what the API changes are that are coming in. So, and hopefully, I think I haven't read through this in detail, Jace, but it looks like, if we say API reviews go through issues with labels or in a repo or what have you, we'll actually go ahead and get there.
Yeah. So Bob has his hand up.
Yeah, I just like a couple of the things that you said and Tim said seemed like very clear guidance on how the overall process should work. And those statements aren't in the doc. So I'm sure the doc is probably pretty useful for the reviewers, but in terms of, maybe it's an audience question, which is if you want an API change, here's the loop you should expect, and you should be getting a SIG approval. As I'm looking through the doc, it just doesn't say those things.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. Like generally, the way things actually work is, so you have a feature you want to ship. The feature introduces a new API or modifies an existing API. You open up a KEP or a design proposal, depending on what you're doing. You associate that as part of the feature when you open that up in the next feature release. During that design process, you should be getting reviews from your SIG. You need an approver there. You need an API approver listed as part of that design process and part of your feature proposal. And that's before you start writing code. Now, if you want to, you can start writing code concurrently with the design process, but that might spin a lot of wheels. Like, you probably shouldn't do that. Well, once your design gets approved and once that gets merged, your KEP or whatever gets merged, and the feature goes in the feature repo for that release, that generally signals that you have agreement from the API approvers for the relevant API, from your SIG, and from the community in general that we're going to ship this.
So I agree that that whole end-to-end process needs to be better documented. And that's part of what we were trying to do with KEP, and we pruned down from the API review process for a while. We made some previous attempts. This time we need to push it over the finish line. I do agree that we need to make that much clearer to the community, and I think we'll have to present it to the whole community multiple times, likely, in order for people to really grasp that. Joe?
Sorry, wasn't muted. I think that flow is totally undocumented. In my mind, from what I've seen, the whole features process has been largely a failure. I think people ignore it and they do what they do. I mean, I'm not like, we need some sort of process here, and so I don't think that it has any teeth, and that's part of the problem that we have here. I'm hoping, and we still have to do some reconciliation between KEPs and the feature process, and really, how do those things relate to each other? That's something that I don't think has been done yet either. Tim is here like, hey, should you have to do a KEP to do an API change? That seems a little heavyweight to me, but like we need to have a, like, you want to make some changes, here's the way that it happens, and wind APIs into that. And then I think on top of that, we got to recognize that we do have choke points. We do have places where we can say yes or no. APIs, command line flags, config changes, and like creating those choke points and using those levers to actually, drive a lot of our other policy, a lot of our other process is something that we shouldn't turn a blind eye towards.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really challenging about the overlap between the KEP and the feature process is that a feature lives across multiple releases right now. Like, a feature goes alpha in one release and progresses through stability, right? And a KEP spans potentially multiple features as well as multiple releases, and is in fact a living document about how we're going to evolve something over the long term. Communicating that has been difficult. Just communicating that to members of my own SIG, and having something more formal around it, or just having some documentation about the relationship would be super helpful. Just so like we have a place to point to someone, and we don't have to like continuously repeat it.
So I did all that work. I tied the feature process to the KEP process, to the release process, and all that stuff. And I met quite a bit of resistance because people didn't understand exactly those delineations that you said. So it may be time to unearth that again, now that KEPs are a little more well understood and socialized. I feel like the three prongs here: the KEP process, the API review process, and then features process tied to the KEPs. So if we can create those sort of hoops around these processes where people know what they're expecting, both as participants and as authority figures within those processes, that's going to make it much easier for the community and us as SIGs as well.
Yes, I want to add it here. And a while back, when I was the release manager, I also tried to resolve this problem. So I have the proposal, like the project issue, which is served as umbrella issue. So leading off the whole feature connected across the multiple repo and also crossing the feature crossing the multiple release could have the umbrella issue to tracking through. So then we could build off the automated tool to generate the report for each release. So you have some release and here it is the issue for that feature. And then here it is the related deliver for each release and also in the different repo, associated repos also. But also got huge pushback from the community. So that's any process. If we don't want to follow any process, there's just no.
Well, yeah, I think we need
solution.
to start pushing back on the pushback because we are at a stage in the process in the project where we have a lot of production users and we have broken backward compatibility pretty much every release for the past year, and we need to stop doing that or we'll start losing production users. Right, so in the past we favored velocity and features and lazy consensus and things like that. I mean, proposals and API changes and PRs in general were never lazy consensus, but we need to get that message across that we're in a stage of maturity in the project now where stability is more important and consistency is more important. So, you know, figuring out and articulating how these processes should work and then iterating on the processes together with the community, I think is a necessity at this point. It can't be a total free-for-all of people doing whatever they want. We have way too many users and way too many contributors. Joe?
Yeah, I just want to like double down on what Brian's saying. I'm in violent agreement there. And it's natural for things to slow down as the core nucleus or whatever we want to call it actually solidifies. This also creates the right incentives for people to build on top of our extensibility mechanisms. It should be painful to get stuff into the kernel, right? Because it's less risky for people to build stuff outside of the kernel. And we should really make it clear that yeah, there's going to be process if you want to change core APIs.
Yeah, and if you look at the commit graph for Kubernetes master, it is down and to the right. So it kind of has the right trajectory from a stability point of view for like the past 2 years. And part of that is success in getting changes out of the core. Part of it is just harder. We have 1,000 open PRs, right? Like we are not keeping up with the review bandwidth, even with auto-closing things. That it's at least stopped monotonically increasing by 100 PRs every release, but it's not going down either. So, we need to be more clear about the bar and about the extensibility mechanisms. We need to focus more on things like testing. We don't have good enough test coverage. We need to figure out how to keep Kubernetes releasable. We have a bunch of these challenges, and we need to rally the whole community around addressing these challenges. And we need to get more people than just Jordan reviewing random API changes. I do want to point out something I mentioned in the chat, which is we do have the bot still automatically identifying API changes. PRs in Kubernetes, at least the touch types.go files are automatically flagged. So that's an additional audit mechanism that we could regularly use to keep track of some of those things. And we could potentially put more barriers in place with respect to approvals for those PRs.
So, I mean, honestly, I haven't seen a lot of PRs sneak through with an API approver change on top of it that actually modified an API that was totally like not documented in a feature, slipped through all of the.
Well, you wouldn't have seen them.
I mean, so at least for the workloads APIs and some of the other ones, I pay very close attention, right? Like I can tell you pretty much every time the API has changed for the past year and a half.
Yeah,
right?
but I don't think that's universally true. We have over 60 built-in APIs now.
Yeah.
So it's really, really hard to keep track of, and GitHub notifications for the past 2 years I've not been able to make work for me at all.
Do we have the same threshold for alpha as we do for, because like I've seen people be a lot.
That's an open question that should be answered in the API review process for sure, is what do we expect to happen in alpha? What do we expect to happen in beta? What do we expect to happen to changes to beta and stable APIs? Because I think those bars and the process will need to be a little bit different.
Yeah.
So I was going to suggest that like we're kind of at the point where I think there's enough input that we can start making concrete steps along this? Is this going to be a set of people who come back in a week or two to this with a set of minimal proposals to move this forward? I'm more than happy to do that with someone else. Just to let's move API review forward. Like, take the ideas from here and from the issues and try to get like 2 or 3 concrete short-term and 2 or 3 medium-term recommendations, and let's start moving it. Not to be too forward-focused here, but we've talked about this for a long time.
Yeah, I would say we have a proposal in place. It's Jace's doc. It's not very long, and that would
And it has a diagram.
It has a picture.
It has a state diagram.
And so I think that should be the place where we iterate. I took a couple of ideas, and I will go and sort of reread the doc and see if I can put a little bit of plain English expectations in there. But like, I don't think we need a different doc or a different process. I think
Yeah, and this one is 4.5 pages.
But that's what I mean is like, so we don't need a different doc. So let's stop talking about it and turn it into a review, approve, comment period, and put a deadline on it. Like, turn it into a deliverable, not a discussion.
Agreed. Yeah. So what I was thinking was we give it a week to get reviews and comments, and then maybe we discuss it at office hours, and if there's no vehement objections, we just ratify it, and I'll convert it to Markdown, put it in.
So I would say all API reviewers need to act that they've reviewed it, and at least a representative sample of SIG architecture needs to also act that they've read and reviewed it. I don't want to turn this into lazy consensus. I want people to have concrete, like, if you are an API reviewer, you should have read through this and understand it, which I'm sure
we have 5 API approvers. We should get sign off from all of them.
And I think SIG architecture, like, anyone on the SIG who's participated in this discussion has a week. I would actually like to get it'd be better if we were doing things like lazy consensus is good, but like include in the doc, like either a reviewer list or a set of people who've reviewed, either said this is okay or they need more time. And I suspect most people will say this is okay after they get their comments in.
Okay, cool. I put a to-do up there for myself to add. So if you're in the API reviewers Google or GitHub group, consider yourself a required reviewer. And I will take care of that.
And either next week or the next meeting.
Yep, next week. Let's come to some consensus by next week, by next Thursday.
So I'm going to specifically call on Jordan, since he does a lot of API reviews. Jordan, do you have any specific concerns about the proposal or things that you think are really critical that are missing? You can unmute.
Sorry, I had read through it once briefly. I think overall it looks good. I think Joe's point about where in the process do we hook in is important. I can see both ways. If you come in too early, then there's a lot of churn before the SIG even agrees with direction. But if you come in too late, then a lot of work has been done that kind of gets negated at the last minute. So I think that's probably going to be the balancing point. That's going to be the trickiest thing to figure out. But other than that,
Maybe we need 2 processes. We need API consulting, and that's where I'm trying to do things like I think we need better linting tools. We need to document more of the conventions. Maybe we have a forum like this where people can just come and ask for guidance or feedback or help. I mean, we already have people doing that. And then the official review and approval is the more formal process.
Yeah, but I think Jordan's point is more like maybe we should just have SIG approval be a prerequisite to API approval. Because the SIG generally is saying this is not the direction we think this particular feature should go in, period. There's no point to reviewing the API.
Well, I agree with that. Yeah.
But that generally actually happens. Like, I think I've seen in general, almost every API change has been something that I've ever seen has been something the SIG is agreed on. It's usually the challenges are just some of the more subtle nuances of the system get lost, which is like a SIG architecture role as much as it's an API review role. API review just happens to be the place where architectural things get surfaced.
Well, if anybody wants to partner with me on that, on figuring out the intake process, please hit me up offline, because I would love to riff on that a little more. Joe or Clayton or anybody else who has some feelings on that, I would love to get more opinions.
Well, I'm not an API reviewer, so, but I think the way that I'm looking at this, though, is I think one of the jobs of SIG architecture is to say no with respect to the unbounded growth of the core parts of Kubernetes. And it's an unpopular thing. And the earlier and the more clear we can be about that no, I think the better off it'll be for everybody. So I think this API review process, I think a critical thing that API reviewers should be doing is also answering that question of like, should there be a cap? Are the right people being consulted? Is this something that should be part of core Kubernetes in general, or is this something that can be done with the expansion, the extension mechanisms that we have? So
I'm for sure anything that requires a whole new API resource type has to have a cap.
And that's actually a good, like, I bet you there's probably like these are good things to add to the doc too. Like, just go and make like a quick, some of these rules of thumb, get them down. Do we generally feel that SIG architecture is, that the SIG's job is to make sure that KEPs exist for the things that KEPs exist, in which case the API reviewer can always just add, do we need something that's like we haven't quite had this problem yet, but generally Joe and Tim have done a good job of like finding things that need KEPs. Do we need to do a better job of that in concert with this, or is that orthogonal?
I think it's totally reasonable. Like anytime any of us are reviewing something, we're like, wow, that's kind of a big sweeping change. This should really have a cap. We need to make sure that the community is aware of this. I think at any point we can call an audible and say, hey, this should probably have a cap. Once something goes through the cap process and it goes to implementable, that's good for everybody, because it means that, it's that much harder to actually undo it, relitigate it. It gives a certain level of certainty as people move towards that implementation.
I agree with that last point very much.
All right, cool. I'm making some comments to myself in the document. If anybody has thoughts about those things that we've talked about, go ahead and just add to those comments, your ideas, thoughts.
Well, yeah, so we did briefly touch on, do we treat alpha differently than beta, differently than V1? As someone who's been brought in on a V1 API approval when I did not review the alpha or beta, I'd have to say that it definitely needs to be earlier than V1. Maybe not, the alpha, but by the time we get to V1, it doesn't make sense anymore.
Since we changed away from annotations, alpha features that change the API intrude on the API's namespace. Therefore, I think alpha falls under.
For field additions to more stable API versions.
Yes.
Well, okay, so I'll be concrete here. I was reviewing the cap that was brought up in the community meeting, right? This is the thing around the namespace stuff. And there's a question around initializers. Are they alpha or not alpha? There's the initializer admission controller, but then there's the initializer mechanism. I know, Clayton, we tagged you in that, right? And I think
I commented they're all alpha, and we hadn't promoted them, but we didn't have the like. This is a good thing too. We don't do a good job of identifying alpha things in the APIs. Like, I might put that in this list as like, that's another gap too.
So I was reading through that cap, and initially I'm like, oh, this is all CRDs. It can all be done outside. Great. You don't even need to actually talk to anybody. Just go build it. But now all of a sudden it's impacting real APIs. There's that alpha thing. Like, all of a sudden that like moves it into a totally new category in my mind.
Yeah, which is why it's a cap. And I think it was actually, that's a good example of where the generic mechanism, like initializers are a great example of, we made two generic mechanisms. One of them didn't quite work as well as we wanted. And we're kind of saying, maybe we want to draw the scope down. This was a perfectly timed one because we were trying to go through the discussion of removing generic initializers. And this is the example of something that is a use case that is very difficult to do without that.
So I was going to say too that since what we're trying to do is preserve consistency of user experience across all API implementations, including in CRDs ideally, that having it reviewed in alpha state makes a ton of sense, because a lot of the conventions and the implementation mechanisms will remain the same through alpha, beta, stable, hopefully. So the earlier we catch those and get people using good API construction hygiene from the beginning, that's just better for everybody and makes it easier to review over the long haul as well.
And most architectural problems are present in the alpha, if they're going to be present at all. So I think from the perspective, both Brian's perspective and the thing about the thing I noticed is like the last minute ones that have architectural implications. Those are almost always alpha. It's very rare that we are ever going to a beta and find an architectural problem. Or, I mean, it's, we've been pretty good at it. I think the bar for alpha should be pretty high. Like in terms of you can experiment, but if your thing isn't going to work at beta because of reasons X, Y, and Z, that should be in the cap. And it shouldn't go to alpha until that's resolved.
I think one of the challenges that I've found is this. So you do a cap or a design proposal, and then you're going to introduce the feature as alpha, right? So you need review, definitely from the API approver before you go alpha. When you promote it to beta, you need to go through review again, even if it's identical. When you go GA, same thing, right? So the review burden is at least three times, and if you change anything more than that for the API reviewers.
Why do you have to get it re-reviewed if you don't?
Because you have to touch. You have to touch.
Yeah, I've never. I mean, maybe Jordan disagrees with me. Like, I've never felt that most of the beta and GA moves are more the subtle stuff. Like Joe's point about when we change defaults, going across groups, but not changing the version and deployments. A lot of those, at least in my experience, a lot of those are. This works. Is it still working? What are you trying to do that's novel? And if you're not trying to do anything, it's a pretty quick approval.
Yeah, the promoted without changes types of reviews are usually pretty quick, assuming they had like initial review so that the earlier versions were actually consistent and coherent.
Yeah,
and reviewed by this person, they're quick.
There is not to pick on SIG storage, but I feel like they get all the thorny API ones, which is that's a SIG that has a lot of API surface area, is trying to do a lot of complex things. Is really important to the ability of people to use the platform for what they want to do with it, but is often like there's a lot of thorny issues because it's just a complex surface area. I think we spend a lot of time on those more so than almost any other SIG.
I think with SIG storage, I think SIG storage can be pushed harder to actually think about how do they factor things, keep stuff out of the core, create pluggability, and use those mechanisms.
Okay, so Paris didn't raise her hand, but she posted something in the chat, so I just want to call that out. It's a good point. All this stuff, yes, we should create documents. We need to present it. If we do present it, it'd be good to record that as kind of a standalone presentation and post it to YouTube so we can point people at that, similar to Tim's code review workshop thing, so people can understand the process better and we can actually walk through it and show examples of what we mean and what we're talking about and how the whole thing works. So I think that would be great.
Should that just be an output artifact of this document at the end, as maybe a short presentation of this is how you walk through an API review that Jace and a couple others could do jointly for the purpose of recording?
Yeah.
That would be super helpful. I've wanted to do that for so many things, governance things and everything else. So this would be a great pilot to test that with. Let's definitely consider that.
Okay.
Thanks, Paris. Woo. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on the agenda. We're about halfway through our time, so I want to make sure it has enough time for the next thing. So Saad, are you in the room there? I can't.
Yep, I'm over here. I'm hiding behind the camera.
Okay.
So last week we had a discussion in SIG architecture about how we can continue to add to SIG storage. Someone just raised the point, SIG storage has a very large API. We have new features that we continue to want to add. And Kubernetes as a whole, we've kind of decided we don't want to continue to expand the core API and minimize that. And the advice from SIG architecture was for the snapshots feature at least to try and implement it out of tree using CRDs and external controllers. We're pursuing that now, and there was some clarification that we wanted to get regarding CRDs in general. There's a couple of use cases that we encountered. So the question essentially is, can core Kubernetes binaries and API objects refer to CRDs?
Yes.
I know. Okay.
Right, that has been true since I wrote the architectural roadmap.
Okay.
Stuff about that. It's in the nucleus. It's intended to be built upon. We want to start moving in the direction where things are first built using CRDs unless the risk is way too high.
Yep.
And as CRDs become more fully featured, that will decrease. I actually want to move to the place where most APIs could actually be implemented as CRDs. If we look at the pains with upgrading versions and dealing with upgrades and downgrades and things like that, it introduces new flexibility that I think we're going to need. And so just in terms of experimentation of features and reducing the amount of stuff in Kubernetes master, it's definitely aligned with the directions of a lot of things that we're going through in the project.
Hang on, so Joe's up, and then I believe Jordan, and then Tim. Joe, Jordan, Tim.
I'd love to hear more about exactly what y'all are thinking around that, because if you have controllers that are built in that are depending on CRDs, those CRDs are effectively part of the official Kubernetes API surface area.
Yes.
And they probably should be reviewed and viewed as such, right? So I think we need to be careful where people don't try and find ways to hack around the fact of expanding the Kubernetes API without expanding the Kubernetes API. Things like annotations, if they're depended upon by core controllers, it's part of the API, right? You can't just like find a sort of a workaround here.
It is a mechanism for building APIs. Jordan?
I was going to ask what you mean by referring to. So does that mean like having a name field, like a foo name field in a core object, and that is implicitly an API group and version and type that is defined by a CRD? Or is it like a fully qualified, like here's the kind and group and name, kind of like we do for owner references and references like that?
I had two use cases in mind. One was a controller dependency. So today we have the attach detach controller, and we want some way to be able to figure out whether that step should be skipped or not. And ideally what we want is an API object to represent an external CSI driver that's installed on the system. Part of one of the fields for that new object would be whether that attach step is required or not. So the attach detach controller now has a dependency on this external CRD object, and I wanted to figure out if that was okay. So that's a controller dependency on an external CRD. The second use case was a API dependency on a CRD, which is specifically for the snapshot use case. We want to be able to, when you provision a new volume, say, provision this volume, but pre-populate it using some existing snapshot. So would it be okay to have a snapshot source added as a first-class field in the PVC object, even though snapshot itself is not a core API object?
We should figure out whether that should be a field at all or not,
Sure.
because it's just a creation time artifact. But other than that specific use case in general, I would say yes. I think we need to look at custom resources more as dynamic resources and think about them just as another mechanism for building APIs.
I'm not sure if there's. Sorry, Jordan. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, as we've seen, people will do lots of things to try to get their pet features into Kubernetes APIs. And if these CRD-based or dynamic-based APIs become things that the core relies on, then we should expect people to change the definitions of those running in their clusters. And so conformance tests around these particular APIs, if they're dynamic APIs that the core depends on, but are mutable by particular installations, conformance tests will be critical for making sure that that is working properly.
I agree with that, but I also think we need more mechanisms to control the lifecycle of those kinds of things that the cluster depends on. And we've had these things from the beginning of time, like the default namespace, the kube system namespace. As we're moving towards more resource-defined policies that are required in order for the cluster to work at all, as we move towards more self-hosted components, as we move towards component config, and we need mechanisms to better control how all these resources are managed that the cluster depends on critically to operate. So I agree with the testing, and that calls back to my point earlier, is we just need more testing generally, but we also need some more controls around these things.
So
So I think to Saad, you got two interesting issues. The second one I want to tackle first, which is inter API linkages, where one is a CRD. I think that's okay. I don't think we have a lot of precedent for that. So I think
don't have any precedent.
I was being nice. So I think you're going to do a little bit of trailblazing. There's going to be some error handling modes that you're going to have to think about that nobody's had to think about yet. Good luck. We're with you. We want to solve this. I think it highlights the distinction between a CRD that is defined. Somebody said earlier, sort of a built-in API that's defined outside of being built in, and a not part of the project API. I think in this case, we're shooting for an API that is in fact part of the project, but is not defined as a built-in. I think that's the goal for a large number of APIs over time, right? Like in the limit, that could be pod, right? And when we can do pod as that, then we know that CRD is actually built enough to support real users, right? That might be 2 years out.
Joe?
So I think, in that particular case, I think it is worthwhile to think a little bit further afield around, okay, I want to, I have a PVC, I want to attach it to a volume that's initialized via snapshot, via clone, via a Git repo. I think we should be thinking about there's going to be a continual number of ways to initialize volumes. And as you think about that, think about could we have an extensible set of volume initializers that people can register? Maybe like a class of CRDs that you can plug into versus special casing snapshots versus clones versus fill it with zeros, fill it with ones, fill it with twos,
Yeah, so the cases that we've had, Git repo, we're in the process of trying to deprecate, but that's definitely a use case. Object stores are another super common use case where people are trying to work around them using Fuse and things like that. And then images is the other one, actual container images.
Yeah, that's good advice. We're going to look at that. It's not a hard set thing. We're just kind of thinking about it and wanting to get advice.
Yeah, I think your trailblazing is the real answer here. I would say philosophically, I'm not against such a linkage. I think we can explore every opportunity for not creating such a linkage.
Okay. So another follow-up question, if a core controller binary has a dependency on a CRD, is the core controller binary allowed to install that?
Yes.
Okay.
But it should also be ready to handle what happens if that CRD is not
if it
found.
doesn't exist.
Yeah. So how do we do this with Cube System and default namespace? We have mechanisms to auto create those as well, right?
There's an interesting thing because I think when you look at when folks do controllers and operators outside of the core, there's two patterns. One of them is that we'll have controllers that actually self-initialize the CRDs that they depend upon at first run. And then there's other ones that expect it to be an install time and administration thing to actually register the CRDs. And it's really all over the map. Personally, I think from a security point of view, it's better if it's an explicit installation step so the controller doesn't have those permissions. So I think some of this is that there's a difference between does the system initialize it versus does that controller initialize it? Because at the end of the day, as we start scoping down the RBAC roles for controllers, we want to make sure that they don't get carte blanche to be able to manage arbitrary CRDs. That's probably not that's not a runtime permission you need to give these things.
So yeah, that is kind of the thing with Kubi Builder, for instance. When it generates a controller, it does do the auto install, but I don't think it gives you RBAC to install an arbitrary CRD. I think it's just, I guess it has to.
I guess that.
It has to. RBAC is not flexible enough to say, I want to give this thing RBAC just to manage these 3 CRDs. It's just.
If you can give it RBAC to manage just those CRDs, then you might as well just install the CRD in that same thing.
Exactly.
I mean, it's fine to do that too. Yeah.
Well, but to be clear, over time, as registering a CRD becomes you upload a schema, there's version stuff. It's going to get more complicated in terms of describing and creating a CRD because right now it's here's a name. Good luck with that, right?
So if I could summarize what you're saying, try and avoid it if at all possible because you could run into RBAC issues and dependencies. which will be hard to manage in the future.
Well, in the same controller, like the controller that just needs to read and write the actual CRD instances.
Yep.
Doesn't need to have the same permissions as whatever installs the actual resource definition.
It doesn't need a cluster role binding. It just needs a role binding. You need a cluster role binding in order to install this here.
Well, it may need a cluster role binding, but it doesn't need the ability to add CRDs.
It's like giving itself permission to create itself versus giving itself permission to run and do the actual job it needs to do.
Yeah, permissions on the CRD object versus the CR objects are separate things.
But if this is just in controller manager, it may kind of be moot because that thing is root anyway.
No, it's not.
No, not even close. Each controller has.
Each controller is scope.
Oh, each controller is scope now. That's cool.
It's been that way for like at least a year.
Just for not paying attention to the whole damn project.
Well, honestly, Brian, it's an option, right? And I think, you know, different installs actually turn it on or off. But when you look, like, if you start looking at the audit output, there's a lot of actors.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. One per controller by default with the installations we have today.
Okay,
Yeah, cool.
So you'd be better off then to assume that the CRD exists and handle if it doesn't.
Or create separate controllers with different permissions or something. Like maybe.
Well, I think it's worthwhile for us to think about a cluster initialization flow that you can plug into for doing things like registering CRDs that do need root, which is a different thing from the controller at runtime.
Right.
So, but I had kind of a follow-up question. So we do picture shipping controllers and resource definitions that are not part of core with the Kubernetes distribution.
That are not compiled in.
They're not
There's
compiled.
a distinction there.
We already do that. We ship add-ons, right? That lay down manifests and lay down things, make cluster autoscaler, and like we have things that we ship that install and run as part of the Kubernetes distribution.
But the add-ons are strictly layered on top of the other stuff. Whereas I think what we're talking about here is like the guts of the volume code actually taking a dependency on a CRD.
Right. I keep painting this picture for people, and you know, maybe it's crazy, but I'm sort of bought into it now. Imagine 2 years down the road when we've actually fixed all the API machinery issues and it's robust enough to do validation and defaulting and conversion and whatever. We should ship a generic API server that has the entire Kubernetes API surface defined as CRDs, and we'll change the word C from custom to common, and they become CRDs for pod and CRDs for service and CRDs for everything. And the only things we really need to be built in is namespace and maybe some sort of access control stuff.
You know, and the CRD.
And CRD, yes.
Yeah, in the discovery API. And
There's a small
just
list
the
of
API machinery itself.
There's a small list of things that we need to be built in to build the rest of the system. And then the Kubernetes distribution ships with the pod CRD spec.
Is it worth at this point thinking about the practicalities of actually doing that? Because at that point, controller manager is not a thing anymore, right? Like you have a bunch of loose controllers that are all communicating independently.
Well, that's a distribution issue, right? Like how you bundle those things together can be.
Yeah, but it's
We've already got some frameworky stuff in place to make the controller manager like logically separate entities within the binary. Like that can be split across directories and still contain the same idea.
So that's really the point. Should we start thinking about how we want to solve that problem?
And we've already been thinking about it. It's just good modularity.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the idea with controllers is you should be able to compile them together or separate as fits your resource.
Controller manager is just a fancy busy box.
Yeah, and we're splitting some of that stuff out with the cloud controllers right now. And as we try to stratify the layers more, I do want to actually make it possible for Kubernetes services and distributions to break out some of that stuff or turn it
There's a
off.
critical thing that I think we're missing here is that as we change the number of binaries that we ship, it's going to be very, very, very difficult to get all the installation mechanisms on the same page around this stuff. So the fact that we don't have a common agreed upon tool set for deployment, I think the closest we have is kubeadmin, means that we don't have a lot of levers, and it's going to be more painful than it necessarily needs to be to actually make that transition that we're talking about.
Well, add-on management's on my radar.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
My thought was really around so with controller manager, it's a bounded performance and utilization footprint, right? As well, also a bounded monitoring surface area. So as you extrapolate many, 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 many controllers, the resource utilization is very variable. The monitoring surface is increased and the performance of the overall system is affected in ways that may not be extraordinarily predictable. And like, to me, like, that's something I'm kind of concerned with. So
I
like,
think you're painting a scenario which is not necessarily that. Like, I wouldn't put every separate controller into a separate binary, run it as a separate entity, but they could be packaged into multiple different groups of controllers.
But I think there's three concerns here. Is that, can we logically move these things around? Do we have the code structure that we can repackage them? The second thing is, how do we manage install if we actually start doing some of that stuff? And then the third thing is, how do we qualify the ongoing operational burden of that, right?
Yeah.
And I think those are all separable issues. I don't think anybody's contemplating a world where every controller is its own binary running as a pod on the cluster.
Yeah.
No, but there may be
Technically, it might be possible, but I don't think anybody's going to go there.
And there may be good reasons for a given installation to want to disable the built-in version of the foobar controller and produce their own.
In fact, for sure. Actually, I think the only reason that it wouldn't be desirable to run every controller separately is that they share memory and it's more efficient to run them together. But on the flip side, we could think about taking the shared informer and running it maybe out of process so you can share caches even if you're running in separate binaries. It's something we could think about.
It would be like a proxy.
Right.
David, did you want to say something?
I was just going to bring up the shared memory thing.
Okay, thanks.
You read my mind.
Yeah, just a time check. We got 6 minutes, and I think this whole conversation is critical and should be codified in some sort of something that can be digested by other stakeholders. So is this a CAP? Is this something else? Is this a roadshow that needs to be
Well, it's not a CAP yet. It's more of a statement of direction. And probably we need to produce an updated architectural roadmap kind of doc, which says this is our current thinking about the direction that we're going. And maybe we need a series of more focused docs on specific issues that are easier to digest.
I've definitely had this conversation at least 10 times in the last 2 weeks.
So I'm going to say, could API machinery produce such a thing about?
It just so happens I have a deck of slides that I've been working on that I think fit in with this discussion pretty nicely. So
one more follow-up question. So if we kind of have an official set of CRDs for, let's say, SIG storage, is there a name that we should be using? So I know for the internal core APIs, we've been using storage.k8s.io. Is there some standard that we should use for the external CRDs?
That's a good question. I actually jotted that down and I forgot to mention it. I made reference in one of the edits to Jace's doc about built-in APIs as a distinct thing from APIs that have a k8s.io prefix. Do we think that CRDs that are effectively part of the project get a k8s.io prefix, and should we sub-namespace that even further?
I think if you want the k8s.io prefix, then the suggestions of the API reviewers
I agree completely.
are mandatory.
I agree completely with that. The point is that we haven't really governed something.k8s.io as API groups. It's sort of been a free-for-all. We have storage.k8s.io.
Yeah, it's definitely grown organically. I mean, my original position was that the kind of the built-in APIs at the lower layers of the stack wouldn't have to be suffixed, and the suffixes would mostly be used for the extension universe. But now that the machinery, so that ceased to be true a long time ago, just organically. So I think it's reasonable at this point just to say the project itself will suffix all future API groups for consistency.
And that we reserve k8s.io and Kubernetes.io for project sponsored.
I mean, those were reserved already.
I know, but we never written it down as such.
Or not anywhere discoverable anyway.
What about SIG sponsored repositories for CRDs? Would that get k8s.io if it was willing to go into 8? Or
great question.
No.
I think that this is really the whole like built-in versus CRD question is really this question is like, when do you get a k8s.io versus?
Well, I don't think it's a question of built-in or not. It's when do you can go through, like the API approval process and say, yes, this is part of the project.
When people are asking the question, can I be a built-in, they really mean, can I get a k8s.io suffix on my?
And they mean multiple things. They mean, can I get into the release? Can I get into whatever? Yes.
I mean, I'd say from historical precedent, the problem really is that we have really just two classes of things that are eventually going to be part of the project, but nobody's willing to say, yep, this is 100% sure we're going to take this. And then the things that are just outside the project and pick their own names. I feel like we spend a lot of time worrying about the former, but the latter is what we want to be encouraging anyway. Like, I like things being, Helm. Like, if the Helm resources were in helm.io, that would be a better outcome, I think, for the project as a whole. Naming's hard. I'd rather people come up with short, distinctive names that match their use case. And, like, every time one of those outside things succeeds by not being in Case.io, we get better as an ecosystem. It offends our sensibilities that nothing lines up, or people use inconsistent case or underscores, but that's not a reason not to do it.
But to the point at hand with storage, like, there isn't an organization like Helm driving the storage work. It is the storage SIG. So should it be storage2.cates.io? Should it be storage.sig.cates.io?
So Joe's comments notwithstanding, and I agree with Joe's comments that, like, I think we want to keep your friends close and your enemies closer. I'm not saying SOD is an enemy, but just judging by the amount of interactions with the rest of the system, I like keeping storage closer, and so storage.cates.io does seem appropriate for.
So storage.cates.io is taken.
Yeah, you can't do that.
Well, you know what I mean.
Yeah,
you add another thing in front of it. Yeah.
They need to pick another name.
CRD dot.
No, don't put CRD.
Don't put the name.
We can just remove all the vowels and go all Flickr.
The idea that storage is outside of Cates.io, or outside, it's a bunch of people from the ecosystem coming together, trying to make something. We're trying to keep it out of Cates.io so that we have the freedom to expand, but we do want to keep an eye and make sure that everything works together well. And, collaboration together, I don't think a subspace of Cates.io is really a problem for storage specifically.
So think about what you guys would want that prefix to be, and that'll be part of the API service.
Okay. Do you think there are going to be other things than snapshot inside of the same group?
Well, snapshot is not that big a deal for us right now. Right now, we're thinking about CSI. So we want some way to be able to represent a CSI driver as a CRD.
So what's cool is CSI is a totally awesome example of the Helm case, where it could be CSI.io.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're out of time. Thanks, everybody.
And the CSI, I think CSI is an extension mechanism, so I think it's totally within scope to figure out what is the right way for us to expose the extension mechanisms. And that's the type of thing where we should be having the discussion about building first-class APIs.
Yep. Interesting.
All right, everybody. Thanks. Have a great rest of your day.